The Spin-off Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
The Fold is brought to you by oMedia, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai hoki mai kia The Fold e mihi nei, ko Duncangree toku ingoa. My guest this week on The Fold is Emma Espiner, who I've been wanting to get on this podcast for quite some time, but she's busy. She's very, very busy for reasons we'll get to. I'm sure regular listeners to this podcast will know who Emma is. If we just kind of narrowly consider her role in the media, she's a commentator and columnist, essayist, and has also produced a podcast, which I think might be the best podcast New Zealand's ever made. That's certainly how I'm feeling right now. And that podcast is about her day job, her real career, which is as a doctor. And the podcast is called Getting Better. It's produced by Bird of Paradise, which is Noel McCarthy and John Daniels' production company. They do fantastic work and was made for RNZ under the New Zealand On Air's Joint Innovation Fund, which is now sadly defunct. But it chronicles her last year of med school, during which she basically went around the country and spoke to what you might call the Māori health system, which is really not any kind of formalised thing at all. It's a bunch of Māori health practitioners working within the Pākehā system and trying to make it work for Māori and doing incredible work, but doing it in spite of rather than because of the system. And you know, it stretches from Northland to the Bay of Plenty. It goes all around the country, and it meets academics, midwives, doctors, and patients who've been on who represent like one tiny element of what is essentially a broken system. It's an absolute masterpiece. And it's been out pretty much bang on a year, but when I first started trying to speak to Emma, it just won the Voyager Award for Best Podcast. So we talk about getting better, about the Māori health system, and about the way that the media sort of interacts with healthcare and with Te Ao Māori more broadly. She has fascinating things to say on both those fronts. We talk about how you balance being a sort of a participant in and a student of a system while also being a kind of a conscience and critic to it, and about how her life is. You know, there's a reason why she took 2 months to show up, and it's because she works at Middlemore. When she showed up, it was around midday, and that night she was starting a 10 p.m. till 8 a.m. shift in one of the country's most extraordinary and high-pressure medical environments in South Auckland. So it's a lot. She's honestly just an extraordinary person. You know, if she were just a journalist and a communicator, she would be, you know, one of the most prized and, you know, awarded in the country. But that's just her side hustle. Her main thing is being a doctor. And yeah, that those two roles and the vision into both worlds that gives you make her essentially unique in New Zealand, I think. Before we get into it, I have to thank our sponsor. The Fold is proudly supported by Vodafone. The spin-off runs on Vodafone's network technology. We actually just hired our first CTO, Ben Gracewood, who will rely on that technology and kind of help shape our evolution into a technology company that operates in the media rather than a media company that uses technology. Anyway, this is Emma Espiner on The Fold. Kia ora, Emma, and welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora, thanks for having me.
We tried to book this like 2 months ago when you very deservedly won the Voyager for Best Podcast, and it's taken a while. Do you want to? That might be because your day job is not podcast host; it's junior doctor now. Do you want to tell us about what the last few months have been like for you, moving into that role? Absolutely full noise.
I think it's probably best that we're talking now rather than a few months ago, because the first 6 months was horrific. I knew that. So I have a cousin who's a few years ahead of me, and she wrote me a letter at the start of this year, and she said, it'll be horrible and you'll hate it. And then somewhere at the 6-month mark, it'll start to make sense and it'll feel less awful all the time. And so we're there now, and she was right. But it's a really scary transition, because you go from being a student and everything is kind of manageable because you've studied it and you're supported, you're not really making any decisions, to being a doctor. And not only that, the hospital where I work and which I love at Middlemore is under-resourced, overwhelmed with really sick patients. And so you're not only doing this thing for the first time and having a real impact on people's lives, but you're having to do it at pace. And you don't know how to filter which decisions you should be anxious about. So you're just anxious about every decision. You go home, you dream about everything that you've done, everything you've prescribed, and then you get up and you do it again the next day. So it takes a bit of getting used to.
That's a phenomenal load. I spoke to Troy Kingy a couple of weeks ago, who's in the middle of his 10 albums and 10 genres in 10 years project, and I asked him whether he felt trapped by a decision he made a long time ago. That's just no disrespect, but an artistic one. You've made this decision 6 years ago, just had your daughter, and now you're really
reaping the rewards of that decision.
and the thing for you is, like, there are all these amazing parallel careers where you could have an impact but have a sort of a normal quote unquote life.
Yeah, I think, and actually my husband said that to me about 3 months in. He was like, are you sure? Like, this seems like not that much fun. And you stressed all the time and anxious all the time. And it's like, well, I don't have another punt at another career now, because I've already made a big deal of doing this one, so I have to stick it out. But the thing about medicine, all those other parallel kind of things that I could potentially do, is that none of it really happened for me until I started training to be a doctor. And so I think that I have to do all the things all at once. I don't, I have these fantasies sometimes of just becoming a writer and going and doing that, but I think the reality is I need that intensity of experience day to day, smashing up against other people's lives and the dynamism of a hospital to spin the wheel for all the creative stuff. So that's fortunate for me.
You've definitely given yourself that. Do you want to? I normally don't do backstories on the Fold, but for a variety of reasons, but I feel like yours is so interesting. I'm very curious about how you got here, essentially, professionally, that, because you've been through Parliament, you have this, as much as you wonder whether you could have, you absolutely could have like an extraordinary career as a writer or a broadcaster or anything else, but you have very deliberately made a decision to go right into the more of this thing.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about your career and how you kind of made that huge, fateful decision?
I guess, I never really went after anything until I decided to go for medicine. So, like, from high school through to my first degree in art history and classics to the career in recruitment, the time I spent at Parliament, they were just either cool people that I'd followed into jobs or things that I'd had a passing interest in. And I'd just kind of been okay at them, and that was how my life had trundled along. And then I was pregnant with our daughter, and I thought, shit, how do I explain to her what this job is that I do? Because I went and visited my nana in Takaka, where my mum's from, and she said, oh, what are you doing now? And I was like, oh, I'm an executive search associate. She was like, that's nice, dear. She had no idea what it was. And I just kind of had one of those moments where I thought, my job's kind of made up. It's not something that really matters and the
strong disagree. As someone who's constantly trying to find people, but that's all right. I can understand feeling that way.
Yeah. And so I wanted to do something meaningful. And I mean, that's a good point, actually. Like, there are people doing every kind of job that exists, and if you find meaning in it, then that's cool. But
it's about you, ultimately,
definitely,
right?
and I had mentors in that field that feel that way. But for me, I just thought, in the zombie apocalypse, like, what are my skills? And then what am I going to tell my daughter about what my purpose is? Was it just to make money and buy into this business and then be a rich kind of bored person? So, I did a very boring kind of career assessment thing of myself, because I didn't, medicine was never on the cards. And I listed every career I could think of, put them all on pros and cons. And medicine was the only thing that came out the other end. And I was tired of being the only brown person in the rooms that I was in. So I think for the 3 years that I was with this executive search firm, there's only ever one other brown person who came through the doors, and the rest were, didn't look like me, didn't look like my community. I wanted intellectual challenge and something that I could do for the rest of my life. Like, I don't have a vision of retiring or anything like that. So, medicine seemed to fit. And I had no science background, so that was an unlikely decision. And it's just because I have incredibly supportive husband, parents and friends. They were either too scared to say, this seems like a fucking terrible decision, kept it to themselves, or were just like, cool, go for it. So we did it. And then, the first, like, going back to uni is hard as an adult student, especially with a child, and especially in that kind of competitive first year where there's, 1,000 odd students trying to get into medicine. And you're the 30-year-old, mother of one trying to, I was going to say try and foot it with the kids, but I didn't really ever try that. I just put my head down and tried to get through the year. But every year it felt more like my place, because you develop those relationships, you find people that are like you, and you find meaning in it. And then, even though this year has been horrible, it still feels like the place that I'm meant to be.
At what point on that journey did you sort of feel confident or start to communicate about what you were seeing and experiencing within the system? Yeah,
well, that was kind of all accidental as well. So when, just to take you back a step, like in 2009 when I met my husband, he was the political editor for TVNZ at the time, and our constant dinner party conversation was the death of the media. There was that, I think there was that movie that was about... So the New York Times, there was a movie, and it was like, this is the end of the traditional media as we know it. And it was very doom and gloom. It was, everyone's going to be out of work. People are going to be uninformed.
Remember it well. It was a great moment.
Yeah. And so that I remember that very clearly. And then once we were in Auckland, because we moved up from Auckland so that I could do this job in this executive recruitment firm, and he went to work for 60 Minutes. I think with the splintering of the traditional media and the emerging of new entities like this one, there was also this parallel push for more diversity, and they're really aligned, which you would be aware of, because as the gatekeepers became less powerful, then there were more opportunities for people who hadn't had time to tell their stories or space to do it, or people that supported them to do it. So I got offered a panel slot on the Paul Henry Show.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, fuck, I've got no qualification for this, but neither does any other party person on there.
That's the thing about panels, right?
Yes. And I had an in-home media trainer, and Guy was like, this is, you might as well, like, it's no skin off your nose. You can easily manage him. And
manage Paul Henry?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that, who knows what else will come from it. So I just started doing that, and then a year later, Newsroom offered me a column. And again, it was kind of like, oh, well, other people seem to be doing this without any talent for it, so let's just have a go. Yeah, and then naturally you talk about what you're seeing. I think it did take me a little while to start really critiquing the health system, because, I started doing that, I think, in my third year. And then, you have to be more mindful of the thing that you're talking about if you're going into that as a job, and being conscious of your junior role in that space. So I just wanted to make sure that I was really well informed when I started, giving it a go.
That's what I was curious about, I guess, is that, it's, I think what you've written and obviously ultimately created the podcast about has been very powerful, but it's also very brave. This is you're saying things that the system is somewhere between sort of self-conscious, belligerent, dismissive, or acutely aware of in various doses and places. But certainly it doesn't necessarily want, certain parts of it don't want anyone to say it, and others would certainly use your youth and all of the other identities you carry against you. And that, did you, when you started to speak, how did the system kind of respond? How did you feel that response?
I think, so this is a really important place to reflect on privilege because, so first of all, I'm older and so have some more life experience. I'm married to a broadcaster, so a lot of the people who might have pushed back against me might potentially recognise the name and think, I don't know if I want to be, known in that respect. And also the time. So my mentors and our lecturers and the people that have been pushing for equity for decades have done all of that work when it was far more dangerous to do that and more risky career-wise. So I felt that it was a calculated risk and that it was worth taking because why else was I there? But, the journey's been different for different people. Like, I'm aware of people, 10, 15 years more senior to me who felt that the environment was so toxic for them that they had to wait until they were senior doctors before they could start to act. And that's obviously entirely valid as well because if you want to change the system from within, you do have to still be in that system. And so people have made calculated decisions all the way along, and mine felt, fairly safe for me. And I haven't really experienced any downside to that, to be honest.
That's kind of gratifying to hear in a way.
I don't know. I'm sure people think it, and there's been, you get the comments on social media, which I don't read, and I've had some weird emails and things like that, but by and large, it's been incredibly positive,
So coming to the podcast, which, I think is some kind of a masterpiece and that functions as both a fascinating piece of storytelling and also just a crushing indictment of a health system that is just so dramatically failing Māori. And again, that's a whole new medium beyond writing or panel shows to get into while you're sort of desperately trying to learn to navigate the thing and to become a doctor. Sort of what possessed you?
It was fucking Noelle. We were just sitting around at her house one day and I was telling her these stories about what I was saying and she was like, this is a podcast. And I thought, okay, that sounds straightforward. And it did at the time, it was like, cool, like I'll hang out with my friend, we'll spend a couple of weeks doing it and it'll be all good. And then...
Because you could have done that. That was also a podcast. You didn't though.
No, we didn't. And it became its own thing. And I think that's what I think anyone that's done any work in Te Ao Māori realises there's like kaupapa within kaupapa. You're never just about the one thing. There's always, 15 other things going on. And so for us, it became that. It wasn't just telling a handful of stories. It was like, and we had Gabriel Baker involved, which was really important because it had to be tika. It had to respect the story sovereignty of the people that we were talking to. It had to not just be about doctors. It had to have, authentic stories from the people that experience the system, from nurses, from midwives, everybody, which... Every time you added another layer, added more time and effort and getting it right. But I'm really proud of what came out. And I'm really grateful for working with Noelle, who's just exceptional at everything, and Gabriel, who just kept us really well supported from a tikanga perspective. And also she's like a fucking genius who's read every piece of health research that's ever been written in this country. So she was the intellectual grunt as well.
So obviously you would have been familiar with the system and the particular way that it interacts with Māori, and there were certain people who you had relationships with pre-existing, but there must have been some kind of, the sense you get of it as a listener is that there's this joined up totality of a vision of all these layered failures and also all these people who are basically hot wiring around those to make it work for their community, but it's in spite of, not because of the system.
Yeah, and I think that's what you begin to understand. And it wasn't so much that I got that from training to be a doctor, but it was from the work that I did working for Hapai Te Haora, which is a Māori public health organisation. So I went there on a summer internship thing at the end of third year and then just stayed on and ended up as their national comms head for the rest of the time that I was at medical school. So they sit outside of, so it's not clinical, all their contracts come from the government, but I got to see all the little things that happen structurally where their contracts were worth less than those that had gone to parkour organisations. They had higher compliance costs because they had to report more frequently. They were less trusted, and our measures of what worked for our people weren't the measures that the ministry was using, and so we had to always translate our measures of effectiveness into something that they understood and just kind of slam it into those boxes. So that was better for me in terms of learning how our community works around the system than actually going through medical school and my clinical training, because you don't really see the community that much. You see people, there's not on a, and that's what we talk about when we talk about cultural safety, is like diminishing the power imbalance between us as healthcare professionals and patients. And when you see someone in hospital, they're at their most vulnerable and you're at your most powerful. So it's quite hard to articulate that within that environment, or the way that people work around the system in the hospital setting. But in general practice in the community, there's a lot more flexibility to do that and see that.
So with the podcast, what has been the response to it from the various people with whom because you don't do something like that without wanting it to impact various audiences. You know, for Māori healthcare people, it's like potentially to be seen. It might well be for government to really just shake them from the sort of apathy of it's just too big to solve, or we'll get to it next year. You know, like, has there been a response, and how would you kind of characterise in terms of it, if you were trying to say, here's a dream outcome versus what has come from it?
I think, so primarily I wanted my colleagues who work in health to feel seen and validated, and for our patients to understand that we get it and that we're wanting to do better. I've been really pleasantly surprised by how it's been received. So it's a teaching resource in our university, not just in medicine but in nursing, and I think the paramedics are using it as well. I get messages from students all the time who say, I've just listened to your podcast. There's quite a few students that have been on my medical teams, while I've been this year at Middlemore, who have listened, senior doctors who have, but that's just listening, right? It's not tangible action. So I recently heard from a doctor at Wellington Hospital, which is in the first episode, which is where the story, Tina and Colin of the Wallaces, really difficult to hear their experience. And this doctor said to me that they've used that to change the way that they look after whānau in ICU. So that had a direct and measurable impact on the way they do things. And I text Tina and I say, this is so cool, And she's great, and she's out telling her story in her community and in the settings that she can speak into. So that's, I think that kind of multi-layer of effect is really what we were after, is that there's a difference, there's a decision, there's change, but also that the people that we talk to feel like their story was validated and meant something, Because that's all, I think what you realise in health, like one of the we always make mistakes, and when you look through, I have a morbid fascination with the Health and Disability Commissioner's website and all the complaints, because the majority of them got to the point of being a complaint because someone felt that they weren't heard. Like, you would be amazed at what people will tolerate in terms of even getting a wrong operation or something outrageous. If you're genuinely and authentically sorry and you commit to not doing it ever again.
To try to learn.
Yeah. So like it's human nature, but I think so that was really important to us, that something that there would be measurable change.
So that's the kind of people with proximity to the front. That's their response. Have you, obviously there have been announcements around a Māori Health Authority, which you touch on, but it was kind of early stages. Do you believe that the top of the system, that the end of the DHBs and so on, will ultimately lead to better health outcomes and a more all-of-system change?
I like that the Māori Health Authority now has commissioning power. So initially, the Heather Simpson Review didn't want it to have commissioning power. It just was going to be a policy body and would make suggestions. So I'm pleased that that's been put in place. I'm sceptical about whether reform is the answer just in and of itself. We have one of the most reformed health systems in the world. We just seem to be addicted to it, and it hasn't had a measurable difference on equity. But you have to be optimistic. I mean, the change is going to happen whether we like it or not. And so we have to make sure that we're contributing to making that. This is the health system that my colleagues and I will be working in. So we have a vested interest into making that work properly. I think from what I understand about what works best in terms of Māori health is that it always is best for us when it comes from us. And so centralising too much, I worry about losing that community, just the nuances of what a community needs, and a community knows what its needs are, and often actually just needs someone to resource it. So I hope that doesn't get lost with the centralisation. And the way that would work properly is having enough representatives from all of our diverse communities within that entity and empowered to be involved in those decisions and guide that policy making. So, yeah, it's a huge ask. But there are some, there's some really easy things that you can just act on, like the Northern DHB. There was a huge stink when they decided to prioritise by ethnicity. And Nicholas Jones at the Herald, who's very good covering health stuff, was laying some of this stuff out, and people were up in arms about it. But it's just, if it is a measurable indicator of increased mortality and morbidity, then you should act on that. It's like Paparangi Reid, who's one of our professors at the University of Auckland, says that racism is in action in the face of need, and that's what we've been doing for so long. So there are things that you can just go ahead and do, but people have lacked the will to do it.
Yeah, and it does feel like it's a political or a
always
messaging kind of a fear of the electorate.
Yeah, and I think actually back to your point about why I haven't, whether I was worried about suffering the consequences with a podcast, I think that's where my confused CV is helpful, because, the thing about working in Parliament is that it's not that you lose respect, but you lose awe of those big, powerful people, because you see them at their absolute worst. And so once you're not really interested in being afraid of people at that level, everyone's on an even playing field from there. So I've just felt equipped to deal with whatever came my way.
We'll just take a quick break and then come back with more from Emma Espiner. The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
And we're back with more from Emma Espiner now. What you just touched on before kind of speaks to in some ways the tension that you describe in the podcast about the sort of reforming from within the system versus wanting to sort of tear it down from without, which you describe as both existing within healthcare but also within Te Ao Māori more generally. Do you want to sort of talk about that? Because in some ways your role as a communicator and critic of the health system while still being a junior doctor and going to work at 10 o'clock tonight, my gosh, means that you can kind of do both at the same time. Is that something that you think you'll continue to do?
Yes, and thank you for highlighting that, because it's something that I've been thinking about this year, because we're all at risk of becoming complicit, and you can't kid yourself that you're not heading in that direction, so you become institutionalized the minute you step into that job, and so there are things that I'm numb to now that I wouldn't have been when I first encountered them. And actually we've found this throughout the podcast, because it was so useful having Noelle, who doesn't have a medical background, because we'd be talking about things and she'd be like, put that in, that's amazing. And I think, that's just like routine now.
Do you sort of stop seeing things in a way just because you experience them over and over?
Yeah, and so that's why that having this broad community of activism is really important, because I need to know that I need to be honest with myself about what I'm pushing for and whether I'm still pushing hard enough, and to have that critical analysis of my, at some point you have to be pragmatic as well about your own career and when you do bring things up, when you don't, what do you let slide? What's your absolute bottom line? And so you need to be in touch with what's the thinking from our our leaders who are talking about health equity and what needs to happen. So I'm really always reading, Paparangi Reid, Elena Curtis, Rhys Jones, Donna Cormack. So what are they advocating for? They're academics, so they're not in the clinical environment anymore, but they're very much connected to what we should be doing. And then what are my students saying? What are they asking for? We've got this campaign at the moment from I think he's maybe a third or fourth year student who's developed this campaign to make pronoun badges for all medical students, which the university didn't support, and he got all this funding through social media and stuff like that. So it's just being really honest with yourself about the decisions that you're making, because it's so easy to fall into this, because people also, they love that you're doing this stuff, and then they want you like the brown mascot for the thing because, we've got this person involved and that makes us look better. So every decision has to be scrutinised about, is this consistent with my values? Is this actually advancing what I want it to advance? Am I at risk of becoming complicit? So that's like super relaxing on top of everything else.
That's what I was about to say, is that like the job alone would be enough.
Yeah.
But
we're all doing this. So I don't know a single Māori woman who's not having that, mental conversation with herself in every field that she's in, because very few of us have the luxury of working in Māori-only environments where we're understood and supported in every way that we need to be. We're all working in these spaces that aren't always safe for us. So that's just how it is.
To what extent do you're obviously very familiar with the media on multiple levels, and to what extent do you believe that the media has played a role in sort of almost like a permission setting for it to be this bad for this long, and exist as it has the potential to be an accelerator of reform, but 100%. Also a resistor? I read your piece earlier about your sort of final column for Newsroom about which talked about the University of Otago's Mirror of Society policies and the extent to which those were, vigorously resisted by a columnist who you don't name. What do you sort of see the media's role in or complicity in this current situation as?
So it's all parallel, right? So we talk about the opportunities that I've had in the media have been through that disruption of the traditional media. And the same thing is happening with the truth telling about what is happening in our country and our history, and that's been through that splintering, and in the past, absolutely, the media has had a role to play in minimising these issues and victim blaming and being inaccurate and actively harmful towards Māori in health, because it often centres around health, because when you think about poor health outcomes, we know that they're structurally derived, and that when you talk about things like obesity and you look at communities where more Māori live and the density of fast food outlets in those communities of where the pokies get targeted, it's undeniable. But for a long time, our media didn't have either an interest or was actively ignorant about those drivers of poor health. So it would just be, fat and lazy and stupid. So.
And then you get right up close to that with the Wallaces.
And you see that, and that harm played out. And so I think with the reckoning that the media has gone through, so with the availability of different platforms, with more diverse voices, with a greater commitment actually to what journalism is meant to be, which is telling the truth. And this is why it's kind of interesting when you have people decrying cancel culture and, it's woke and it's this and that and the other thing. It's like, actually, no, you guys should be offended that your profession didn't do its job properly. The inaccuracies in the reporting that's highlighted as racist, that even if you don't care about racism, you should just be ashamed that your profession told lies.
Totally. Well, and was actively involved in shoring up a system which privileged a white majority.
I don't think you're going to win them on that, but I think you can say, because they don't, you're not even allowed to say white privilege to these kinds of people. But if you can say to them, look, you weren't actually even doing the basic job of journalism, which is to get the facts right, that's somewhere to start.
I do think, I don't know. I mean, you're right in terms of that phrase is triggering to sensitive audiences.
As is triggering.
Exactly, Jesus.
Yeah.
But it does feel like when you look upon, we recently had a documentary on the spin-off about Mike Smith and taking a chainsaw to the spine on Tree Hill. And I remember I'd only just come to New Zealand I think I would have been like 12 years old when that happened. And I remember the coverage. I remember there was this very simple way of understanding what had happened. And then watching that now, you sort of, it feels different. And I think you look at some examples of reporting from, it's really not that long ago, and of what was an acceptable column to publish or acceptable cartoon to publish as recently as like 2017 when Al Nisbet was at large. You sort of see just how reinforcing of just these super ugly stereotypes,
But it's also so limiting. I think, even if you step aside from the harm that they've caused, it's what a boring vision for New Zealand, it robs us of much more complex and interesting stories. So if you look at that recent piece by Professor Richard Shaw, who wrote for The Conversation about how his Irish immigrant ancestors came to New Zealand and were given confiscated Māori land in Taranaki, and then within a generation their economic prospects had changed from being basically impoverished peasant farmers to being, landed gentry. And that was all off the back of policies which, disinherited Māori of our land. And so that piece was great because it's like, shit, that's a much more interesting story than the one that we'd been told. And there's reconciliation that comes from that once, people acknowledge that that's the truth. And then he draws the line from, all the intergenerational wealth stuff that accumulates over time and how he's been privileged by that. And I just think that's just so much more hopeful for our country to have those kinds of stories out there rather than, wires to do being rammed down our throats.
Yeah. So on Te Reo and it's kind of, obviously it's a current, basically a bunch of media has started using it in a fairly small and contained and not non-confrontational way, and it's been taken a particular way by a segment of the electorate, I guess. But what they're trying to do, and I think hopefully it is doing, is saying that this media is not just for Pākehā New Zealand, that it is for more than just that, and that also feels like it's a theme of getting better, that the health system, just by making some whether it's accommodations or just being more kind of culturally aware or aware of the nature of our society, that it can open up to and be a lot more effective deliverer of what it needs to.
Yeah, and it's that they are the same in a way as that, when you take your baseline as Pākehā New Zealand, then it doesn't work for anyone else or it doesn't work as well. And it's the same in the media. And I heard your conversation with the minister and talking about who Morning Report's for. And, those kinds of audiences are well served by what exists currently and won't lose out if we create things for other people as well. In health, it's incredibly urgent because that Pākehā baseline has meant that Māori aren't getting good care and aren't getting the right care. Even things as basic as, the entry point for cancer screening, for bowel cancer screening isn't right because it's the Pākehā baseline, not Māori, which is younger. And yet they haven't made the easy decision, which would be to screen Māori earlier for all reasons. There's always reasons, and it's resourcing. It's, we don't have the plan to roll out at the moment. There's always something, but you have to bring it back to that, this is inaction in the face of need. And if you're not doing the right thing for Māori, you're saying you can wait and receive less care and less quality care while we just carry on treating the baseline Pākehā with best practice. The diverse audiences thing, I think, is really fascinating. So everyone's now kind of acknowledged that you need to deliver to people that might not have been well served by the media in the past. But still, I haven't seen a shift in leadership positions that tells me that these organisations are serious about sustainable change. So it's all very well and good to put out a pitch saying, we want, young Pacific audiences, so, these production companies or groups to send in their pitches. But if the person that's sitting in the commissioning chair doesn't has only ever commissioned for the morning report audience on the terrace, how will they recognise good quality work that comes across their desk or pitches from these communities that they haven't served before? So,
and how will they even go make sure that the whole community knows that it wants them rather than just the same people who...
Exactly.
Because there's a danger that it's just...
it's a box tick, we need to get some Pacific stuff and some Māori stuff and maybe some, queer stuff as well, and then we're all good. So, it has to be really radical structural change as well as putting those nice things out the front. So, and I know there are some people in some of the funding bodies who are aware of that, but some organisations are slower to shift than others, and actually don't recognise that that's a gap for them, which is concerning.
So do you, as someone who's now, right up close to both these things, do you, and you're at the end of that sort of 6-year journey and through both of them, do you feel, characterise your emotions, are you hopeful about the way that the interaction of, journalism and communications and health can start to salve these wounds?
Yeah, and I think, yes, absolutely, because medicine has always been about storytelling. So we get patients to tell us their stories. We then tell those stories to our colleagues. Sometimes we write those stories up for medical journals as research, it is storytelling as a profession. And we have a responsibility to tell the stories that will influence change for our patients. And it's the most powerful advocacy tool that I have available to me. Like when I look at where I want to spend my time, I have to do some research projects for my, eventually for specialist training applications and for my CV, and also because I like hanging out with my colleagues. But the cut through is going to the media, telling a story, creating some energy around something, and then, not allowing an issue to be ignored. I think with our politicians, you need to make it impossible for them to ignore you rather than try and influence them behind the scenes to do the right thing. Like, great example, Kiritapu Allen this year, when she had her cervical cancer diagnosis, incredibly brave, public sharing her story. The self-swabs for cervical cancer screening, which have been, this is years of advocacy with research and with experts and going through the right channels, and the government would not fund it, magically got funded once Kiritapu started talking about it and sharing her public journey. And the government denies that had anything to do with it, but it's just like a remarkable coincidence. But that's the power of storytelling and doing it the right way.
Well, I think that you're about as good a storyteller as exists anywhere in the world. And I think that I feel like you are going into a health system and it should be kind of trembling but excited, like freaked out over what you're going to do to it, but also the parts of it have been looking for someone to kind of break out. That's, they're getting a fourth. So anyway, I'll let you go back to
preparing for my night shift. Yeah, trembling and excited is probably appropriate. Yeah.
But thank you so much for coming up here, Mo. Really appreciate it. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to O Media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spin-off Podcast Network.